So, what are functions? Why are they important? Why are they the most awesome thing in coding? And how do we actually implement functions inside of Thunkable? Those are the questions we're going to be answering in this video. Hey friend, Darren here from Thunkable xTutorials and xTutorials.io, and in this video I'm going to kind of share a generic brief overview of functions and how and why we use them inside of Thunkable. So let's answer that first question. What is a function? Well, a function, I guess kind of a loose term, is just kind of a chunk of code. If you think of another word for it, might be like an algorithm. An algorithm is a detailed series of steps that performs a specific task. So the classic example that I've always heard is like a recipe. So if you want to, cook a casserole, well, you need to first get all your ingredients together. Then you need to chop up all the onions and all that good stuff. And then you need to put in all your dry stuff and then your liquids and then so on and so forth. Bake it in the oven. And what you have there is a detailed series of steps that performs a specific task, which is making that casserole. And so we can think about that term, the algorithm, as the definition of what a function is in coding. And functions are used across all types of coding. So no matter what language you go to or what system you're working on, whether you're working in mobile apps or you're working and making websites or applications, anything, functions are a basic concept of coding that you need to know. So again, a function is a series of steps, and there's really two reasons that we want to use functions, or that we use functions, that I see. There's really two cases that you want it. The first is you want to separate out a piece of code to make it more readable. So you want to, a specific step, a specific task, you want that separated out so that it's easy to kind of see what that piece of code is doing. Okay, so that's the first one, is making your code more readable, is one way to put it. The second case is you want to reuse a piece of code over and over again. But you don't want to keep writing that code out over and over again. So imagine you're using a piece of code, 10 times that has 10 steps in it. So rather than writing out those 10 steps 10 times in 10 different places, and then every time you need to update that, having to go update that 10 times, you can only update it one time and then it updates everywhere else. So that's kind of the loose term of functions. Why are we using them? Those two cases. So let's actually look at some examples of each of these cases. So we are looking at some of the blocks from my Maze app. I'll link down to that playlist down below. But here, let's just look at just kind of the blocks of this inside of Thunkable, okay? So the first thing I wanted to show was reusing pieces of code, okay? So you can see here, I have a function that's called display current cell. And you can see here that this little block, which is a function that I created to my functions, it's over here, okay? I created this function, and I'm calling this function 5 different times on the screen. So you can see here, I'm using this block 5 different times. And the definition of this function is over here. So it has a simple little if statement in it, and then it does 3 things, okay? Now, each of these, and we'll look at these in a second, each of these, say they have 30 blocks. Now, can you imagine me writing out all 30 of these blocks every time in each one of these events? So when the maze starts, when this screen starts, or when this button's clicked, when this button is clicked, when this button is clicked, when this button is clicked. I mean, that's multiplied, 30 times 5 would be 150 blocks. Again, that's that's just crazy. But what functions allow us to do is to reuse these blocks. So I only have to write them out one time, and then I can call them, whenever I need that chunk of code. Okay, so a function is a chunk of code, and I can reuse it. So that's the first case. So let's actually look at what this is. And this kind of gets into our second example, which is readability. So we can see here in my display current cell function, inside of this, I have 3 functions here. And why I chose to do it this way is because each of these has like a big old thing of code in it. So, you know, what does all this do? When I come back to this app a year later, or if someone comes and looks at it, you know, what does this do? Well, I can just look at the name of the function and it says that this chunk of code updates the buttons, or this function updates buttons. All right, so if I need to update buttons, then I know I need to come look at the code in here. Or if I need to increment the move count, well, then I can just come look at this and see what it's doing. All right, so I hope you can see that this is allowing us to separate out pieces of code and making it more readable. So that's our second case. So why do we use functions? The first is reusing code, or one of them is reusing code, and the second is to make our code more readable. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people, or people have shared apps, and they just keep writing this stuff out over and over and over again, and it's just very painstaking to go back and update that. So if you need to make one small change, you have to do it a bajillion times. So anytime you find yourself doing something over and over and over again, especially when you're blocking on a single screen, try to think, you know, is there a way that I can make this into a function so that I can reuse it later? And one of the things that might help you do that is adding inputs and outputs to your functions. So let's actually dive into actually creating a function using inputs and outputs, and you can kind of see how those work as well. Let's add in let's do like a button and a label and text input. All right, so let's say when a button is clicked, we want to take the value, so from input, get text, and we want to update that inside, or show that on the screen rather. Let's say the user is inputting some bad data and we want to format that a little bit. So let's go ahead and create a function here, and there's 2 options here, one with a return down here and then one without a return. Let's do one with a return so we can show an input and output. And we'll call this function format text. And I also want to take in an input for this function. So I'll go ahead and add in an input. And in this input, let's just call this original text. And so this is what the user initially entered. All right. And then from this, we're going to return something else. All right. So let's take this original text. Let's say we want it to be all caps. So what we can do is, now that we have said with original text, what that has done is created a variable for us. So we can go ahead and update that text here and say set text to uppercase, and then grab original text again. And maybe this is bad language. Let's go ahead and update that, because since I'm updating it, it's no longer going to be the original text. So let's just label that text. And then update these. Boom, boom. Cool. So set text uppercase to text. So this is going to take in text. It's going to then update that text to be uppercase. And let's say we also want to join something to it. So entered colon, and we want to add a comment. Let's see. No, we want to we want to duplicate this. I'm trying to think what I'm trying to do. And boom, so we can add in that on the returned value. So pretty simple. So we take in text, we make it uppercase, and then we're returning this joined text to the front of it, so entered text. So what we should expect is when we throw something into this function, it's going to add entered to the front of it, and then everything after that will be all caps. So here is our function format text. And so if we want to format this text input value and then update it here, now all we need to do is come to our function, throw in format text, and then now we can use that function, and boom, that is how it works. All right, and let's go ahead and just, take a look at how this works. And the screen looks terrible, but we're just showing functionality here, okay? So we'll type in like some kind of text. I don't know what language this is, but whatever. So here we have text, just a bunch of random letters, and let's go ahead and press the button, and then boom, you see the label was updated. It now says entered space, and then it has what we originally entered in the text input field, and that is in all caps. So our simple little sandbox function is working. So that is the basic overview of functions. I hope you enjoyed and you kind of understand functions a little bit better now. Again, functions are like algorithms. They are a detailed series of steps that perform a specific task, and we use them in coding and in Thunkable to either break out a piece of code to make our code more readable, or to reuse a piece of code over and over and over again so that we don't have to keep on, copying and pasting it everywhere and updating it a bajillion times. Functions are really, really super useful. And then in this last example, I showed you how you can add an input value to your function and also return an output value from your functions. So that is all I have for you today, my friend, on functions. Thanks for checking out this Thunkable X tutorial. And this is Darren signing off. As always, happy coding.